Welcome everyone. My name is Zen Honeycutt of Moms Across America. You are on the new MDs, moms, doctors, and scientists working together to heal our children. I'm so honored to be here as the representative mom to be able to talk to doctors and scientists to get to the source of what is going on with our health issues in America today. And today is a huge one. It is turbo cancer. And we have our host, Dr. Michelle Perro. She is the author of What's Making Our Children Sick and the founder of GMOscience.org. That is an incredible book. I highly recommend it. We also have Stephanie Seneff, PhD. She is a senior scientist at MIT and the author of Toxic Legacy, How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Health and the Environment. And again, I'm Zen Honeycutt of Moms Across America, author of Unstoppable, Transforming Sickness and Struggle into Triumph, Empowerment, and a Celebration of Community. We also have the esteemed Dr. Makis with us today. Dr. William Makis, MD, is a cancer researcher trained in radiology and oncology. He practices and in his practice involves diagnosing and treating cancer patients. He has over 100 peer-reviewed articles in international journals and an undergraduate degree in immunology, and his Substack is amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Makis, for coming on today. We so appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And today we're going to be discussing turbo cancers, and this is something that unfortunately, I think might be touching almost, hopefully not every family in America, but many people in America. I know my mothers are asking, why is this happening? Are our kids at risk? Is there anything that we can do for their family members? Personally, I have two very dear friends close to me struggling with cancer right now. And one of my other friends, her father got the vaccine and a booster, and within a couple of months had to have his leg amputated due to the fact that it was growing tumors so fast and so quickly. His one leg itself weighed over 60 pounds. He couldn't walk, and he had to have his entire leg amputated to fight the spread of turbo cancer. So this is what's the phenomenon right now? It's very fast growing, aggressive cancer that it's shocking and it's tragic. And we want to address this on the show in a scientific way with doctors who are seeing this, on every day on a daily basis. So before we get into Dr. Makis's experience and asking him questions about what's going on, we're going to have Dr. Stephanie Seneff give us an overview, an immunological review of the science behind COVID vaccines and cancer. So Dr. Makis, of course, we would like your feedback on and have a discussion here along with Dr. Michelle Perro on what Stephanie Seneff presents. And of course, we will have questions from the audience. So Stephanie, thank you for being on with us. Would you please show us what you've been working on?
Exactly, yes. And I'm hoping you can see these slides on the screen.
And okay, here we go. There
we
go.
It?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm just running through a few slides here, sort of trying to paint the picture of how these vaccines could be causing turbo cancer. I've done a lot of research in this area, and I know Dr. Makis has as well. So I'll start with the big picture. The mRNA vaccines, they induce an intense inflammatory response. So this results from the fact that the messenger RNA is engineered. It's not normal RNA. It's got all these methyl pseudouridines throughout the molecule that cause it to be very resistant to being broken down. So it can stick around for 6 months, still making spike protein all the while, whereas normal messenger RNA disappears in a few hours after it's made. So this is extremely abnormal. And that spike protein is extremely toxic. Many people have written about the toxicity of the spike protein. It causes an intense immune response. And this causes these IgG antibodies to be formed in large numbers. And IgG is a particularly bad kind of antibody to have too much of, especially if you don't have enough of the IgM and IgA antibodies. It causes, it's much more likely to cause autoimmune disease through molecular mimicry. And so the immune system overreacts and then tries to cut back on that overreaction. And it does that by suppressing the immune system response. And it does that in 3 different ways, I believe, suppressing the type 1 interferon response, which is really critical for fighting viruses and also for fighting cancer. And then as you get more and more boosters, you start to see this IgG4 going up. And in fact, there's a paper here by Vladimir et al. Published in Vaccines in 2023. And Dr. Makis is an author on that paper, so I imagine he'll have some comments about this. But this IgG4 is very interesting because it's form of IgG that doesn't protect you. It does the opposite. It actually gets in the way of the other IgG antibodies. And he has a long section in this article about the potential for that causing cancer. So the impaired immunity not only causes increased risk to infection, it doesn't protect you. The IgG goes the opposite of protecting you from the virus, but it also doesn't protect you. It causes you to be more susceptible to cancer, both cancer to happen and cancer to become malignant. So this type 1 interferon response, I was an author on a paper here from food chemical toxicology, where we went into detailed explanations for how the vaccine could mess up type 1 interferon. It's very, very interesting because the cells that are exposed to the mRNA vaccine produce large quantities of these exosomes, which are these lipid bodies that are released by the cell. They go into circulation, and they contain, in fact, these particular microRNAs that are known to interfere with type 1 interferon. And so this results in innate immune suppression. And then these microglia are these immune cells in the brain. They take up those exosomes and they react by producing a lot of inflammatory agents that can cause mutations in DNA, for example, and can eventually lead to brain cancer. Type 1 interferon deficiency increases the risk to cancer and to infection from latent viruses. And all of this is showing up in the VAERS database. So I have a couple of examples here of data from the VAERS. VAERS is this database that the US government maintains. And I have spent a lot of time looking through VAERS. We did a lot of analysis.
Just 1 minute for people who don't know what VAERS is. It's the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System that has been set up by the CDC that doctors and patients can report vaccine adverse events for afterwards.
Yeah, and it's a very valuable database for looking at what's going on with the different vaccines. And so in this same paper, Food and Chemical Toxicology, we have a lot of data on various numbers on the counts of occurrences of different things with the COVID vaccines compared to all the other vaccines that were delivered in 2021. And the numbers are just astonishing because these are different words that are related to cancer, lymphoma, leukemia, metastasis, carcinoma, neoplasm. So we could look at the counts in the VAERS database for that year, which was when the vaccine was introduced, for all the COVID vaccines, and then for all vaccines altogether. And you can see that almost all of the cases, 98% of the mentions of cancer were COVID vaccines. It's hugely more highly represented than the number of COVID vaccines that were received in that year. So it's way out of line with the other vaccines. And this is something that I found on the web is another analysis of, again, the same database. They compared the COVID vaccine to the flu vaccine. So this is the COVID vaccine, this is the flu vaccine. The counts for these two different vaccines normalized by the total number of vaccines administered. And for neoplasm, breast cancer, lymphoma, lung cancer, prostate cancer, brain neoplasm. So all these different conditions, you can see the numbers here for COVID, there's practically none for the flu vaccine. So in many cases, the ratio is infinity. So this is just very striking to me that cancer is something that these vaccines cause that other vaccines don't cause. And now you can see some of the evidence of why that might be. And this was a very interesting paper to me about this PD-L1, overexpression of PD-L1. That is a very dangerous thing to have because that is going to link to cancer. And so this was measured 2 days after the second vaccine. So they had their 2 vaccine series. And a quote from the paper, an activated immune system needs to be regulated to avoid autoimmune collateral damage. And that's what's going on. There's such an intense reaction that the immune system cuts back and it tries to stop it by elevating this PD-L1. You can see here's the control data. And this is the vaccine recipient.
Stephanie, can you just tell us a little bit, what is PD-L1?
Yeah, I will get to that in a moment, but it is a particular receptor. It's a molecule that's produced by both cancer cells and immune cells. And it basically, just like IgG4 in a way, it gets in the way. It blocks the immune cells. It says stand down. It prevents the immune cells from responding to both the virus, the COVID virus, but also to cancer. So it can cause, again, a dangerous increase in the potential of having cancer. And you can see this dramatic difference between the controls and the people 2 days after the vaccine. Vaccinations may have a non-specific immunosuppressive effect lasting for a certain period of time. This is a quote from this paper. So they're concerned about this non-specific, meaning that it could suppress the immune system response to cancer. And then here's a paper, PD-L1, PD-1 signaling. Those two hook together. You can see the picture here. The cancer cells produce this PD-L1. It hooks to this PD-1. This is an immune cell, and it basically tells the immune cell, look, don't touch us. We're good. So the immune cell is unable to clear the cancer because of that. The cancer has this protective mechanism of producing this PD-L1. And that can inhibit the activation of these T lymphocytes, which are these immune cells, and enhance the immune tolerance of tumor cells, therefore, by achieving tumor immune escape. That's called tumor immune escape. And in fact, people have developed antibodies to PD-L1, as well as antibodies to PD-1, the thing that engages with it. These antibodies can then prevent the PD-1 and PD-L1 from engaging, and then it can prevent the tumor cell from disabling the T cell from being able to attack the tumor. So it's a popular thing to do, is to provide these antibodies to help protect from cancer. So the fact that it's producing PD-L1 is not good. That is definitely not good. And this is the end of my presentation.
Wow. Thank you, Stephanie. There's always a lot to digest there when Stephanie speaks. Dr. Makis, if you're not familiar with Dr. Seneff, I know you are. So we have created a series of questions and conversations, but before we even get into that, perhaps you'd like to, one, comment on Dr. Seneff's presentation, and number two, what sparked my thinking during it is that we're now creating antibodies in cancer research against these PL and these PD-1 and PD-L1 receptors, so we can increase a certain kind of cell called natural killer cells, which are tumor surveillance cells. And children, I'm a pediatrician, just so happen to have lots of NK cells around. So we've given them something that wipes out their NK cells, and we're creating antibodies to increase NK cells. Is this clown town? Am I missing something? Perhaps you can explain a little bit here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure seeing Dr. Seneff's presentation, and this work is extremely important. It's important because we don't understand fully the mechanisms that are in play with these extremely aggressive cancers that are arising in people who've had COVID vaccines. This is a brand new phenomenon, and it's got its own name. And people are calling it turbo cancer. Turbo cancer is not a medical term; it's a lay term that has arisen on social media to describe the behavior of these extremely aggressive cancers in people who've had at least one COVID vaccine. And that is how I define turbo cancer. We can start with a definition. My definition of turbo cancer is it is a cancer induced in a person who's had at least one COVID-19 vaccine. I tend to believe that this is a phenomenon specific to mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. I haven't seen enough evidence that the AstraZeneca or the J&J vaccines could produce these cancers as well. There just isn't evidence for that yet. It may be, we may find out down the road that maybe this is a spike protein issue, and anything that uses spike protein can be causing cancer. But for now, it really seems to be a phenomenon with Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Going down this path in terms of, for example, just the PD-L1 and PD-1 signaling with these receptors that connect and basically prevent the immune system from taking out the cancer cells. And that, I think, is overall what's happening here with these cancers, is that there is some kind of an immune suppression. And both a suppression of the immune system and a suppression of immune surveillance that is allowing these cancers to just grow extremely rapidly and then metastasize very, very aggressively, and then giving people a very poor prognosis. So I wanted to mention about this PD-1 and PD-L1 signaling, because this is actually a multi-billion-dollar cancer drug industry right now. And I'll give you the names of some of the pharmaceutical companies involved. So, for example,
okay, hold on. Let's sit down. Oh, we are sitting down. Go ahead, Dr. Makis.
So, and I'll just give a few names. I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but just a few interesting names, because there are drugs on the market right now that are either PD-1 inhibitors, so that's on the immune cells, or PD-L1 inhibitors, and that's the receptor on the tumor cell. So PD-1 inhibitor, the most popular one is Keytruda, and it's owned by Merck. Now, Merck used to have a patent for ivermectin. And in the pandemic, early on in the pandemic, Merck came out and said, don't use ivermectin. It doesn't work for COVID-19. And of course, that allowed the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines, which we now know cause cancers. So now we see Merck involved on the other end of it, where they are now benefiting financially from selling cancer drugs like Keytruda, which is a PD-1 inhibitor. But also, you'll be interested to know that Merck is a 50-50 partner with Moderna in the new mRNA cancer vaccines, which are in phase 3 trials in Australia. And Merck, the deal that Merck has with Moderna is they will get 50% of the profits once their mRNA cancer vaccine comes out. So that's just one example. And then an example. So Merck also has a PD-L1 inhibitor called Bavencio, which it acquired from Pfizer. So you see these names propping up where, these companies are now benefiting from this explosion of cancers that we're seeing in COVID vaccinated individuals. And there's another PD-L1 inhibitor called Imfinzi, which is owned by AstraZeneca. And of course, the other companies involved in these drugs are Bristol Myers Squibb, Regeneron, Roche. So these are huge pharmaceutical companies that have drugs that, for example, deal with this PD-1, PD-L1 pathway to try to stimulate or re-stimulate the immune system into killing tumor cells. So that's just a little aside that the pharmaceutical industry is going heavily into cancer treatment, investing heavily. We just saw Pfizer complete a $43 billion acquisition of Seagen, which has a number of cancer drugs, both on the market and in the pipeline. We see Johnson & Johnson acquiring cancer drug companies. We see biotech saying that they are going to go heavily into cancer drugs in the coming year or two so that they can become revenue positive again. And AstraZeneca as well is involved in this oncology space too. So
Dr.
that's,
Makis, Dr. Makis, so obviously this is big money. Can you give us any type of idea on how much it costs per month, let's just say for a cancer patient that are on some of these drugs? Do you have any idea of how much they cost for the patient?
It really varies widely, but I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. A whole treatment course could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. These things can get very expensive, and it's big money. Some of the drugs that I've mentioned bring in revenues of over $1 billion annually, and so this is big business. And there are big cancer centers being built all around the United States. I've done a Substack article on this. Big cancer centers that are slated to open in 2024 or 2025. The Pfizer CEO, Albert Bourla, has told us that their number one focus will be cancer from 2025 until 2030. That is going to be their big revenue generator, is going to be cancer.
And they know this. They know that cancer is coming in a big way for the American
public. They knew. And also you may not know that what's happening now locally is that there are emergency rooms just for oncology patients now. That's what they're setting up here in the US. So the oncology patient, it's so big that they can afford their own emergency departments. And if you're on some kind of immunologic drug, some of the BAB drugs for cancers here locally, let's say at UCSF, they run about $50,000 a month for a shot a month.
Okay.
It's about $50,000. So we're talking a big cash cow regarding this industry. I'm going to ask another question, change gears a little bit. I have two questions stemming from what you say. This is what patients ask me. When they have these cancers or immunologic dysfunction, autoimmunity leading to cancers, they'll say, it's long COVID. It's not from the vaccine. My kid, I have someone like this. My kid had 5 vaccines, but she did fine with them. But what she has is long COVID because she's had COVID 3 times. So how do we discern that it's not actually long COVID, long C, versus from the vaccine? Can you maybe shine a little bit of light on that for us?
Well, I can tell you when you look at some of the data in 2020, we didn't see these cancers in 2020. These extremely aggressive cancers presenting in young people, people in their late teens, 20s, 30s, these extremely aggressive breast cancers, colon cancers, lung cancers, lymphomas, leukemias. These are my top 5 turbo cancers that I am seeing in COVID vaccinated individuals. Lymphoma, leukemia, breast, colon, and lung are the big ones. And then, of course, you've got the testicular cancers, the sarcomas, melanomas, even kidney cancers as well, pancreatic, and so on. So we didn't see it in 2020, which is when you would expect to see it, given that COVID-19 didn't start circulating in 2020. It started circulating in 2019. And according to Dr. Paul Alexander, who served under former President Trump and had access to all kinds of evidence and information, the the SARS-CoV-2 may have been circulating even earlier than 2019, maybe 2018. And so if this virus had been circulating and people had been infected with it and they didn't know because it was just like another respiratory virus and a pandemic hadn't been declared, we should have seen this explosion of extremely aggressive cancers in 2020. And I have not seen any evidence of it. I have looked at the data that has been put out by Ed Dowd, for example, John Baudouin, who has death certificate records of Massachusetts. I think he has about 1 million death certificate records that he's analyzed. I have not seen any evidence that there was an explosion of these extremely aggressive cancers in 2020. However, you do see an inflection point in 2021 once the COVID vaccines are rolled out. That's when you start to see a rise in these cancers, cancer diagnosis, and of course, cancer deaths as well. And it just continues to rise steadily throughout 2022 and 2023. I mean, it has been just a steady upward trend, which again, you wouldn't expect if this was an issue with COVID infections or long COVID. So again, we need more data, and I'm always, I'm always open to possibilities that, and maybe we will one day see evidence of patients with long COVID developing cancers. I'm just not seeing it at this time.
That's an interesting observation regarding this long COVID, because what we're really dealing with is spikeopathy, but the spike protein from the virus or whatever this creation is. And we know, and because Stephanie's also done a beautiful paper on this, reverses the pseudouridine, and it's this pseudouridine that's created all sorts of havoc. Is not the same. It's not the same spike, even though I call it spikeopathy for patients or spike proteinitis for, just for ease. It's not the same. So, and that subtle amino acid difference has made this huge immunologic difference.
I want to say it's not just the methyl pseudouridine is in the messenger RNA, and it makes it very hard to break it down. But the spike protein itself has also been modified. It's got these two prolines replacing other amino acids that cause it to not be able to get in, but it sticks around and, for example, suppresses the ACE2 receptors. So I think it behaves differently from the natural virus version of the protein in ways that we don't yet understand.
So I can actually give you a list of the ways the vaccine delivery of the spike is different from someone who's been infected. And Dr. Seneff just mentioned the spike itself is different. The mRNA, of course, is modified with the methylated pseudouridine. You then have the lipid nanoparticles and the delivery mechanism of the mRNA and eventually the spike. And the delivery is the key here for me, because a person who's had a vaccine is being injected into the arm. We know that most of that injection ends up in the bloodstream. There's some estimates saying about maybe 75% after several hours ends up in the bloodstream and ends up being delivered systemically to the bone marrow. It's delivered to the testes, to the ovaries.
It goes into the lymph system, and from the lymph system,
the lymphatic
it makes
system.
its way to all those organs.
Exactly. You end up, you can have it picked up in the hepatobiliary system. And so it ends up in the bile ducts, and it ends up in the gallbladder and the pancreas and
the placenta crosses the placenta.
Yeah,
it crosses the blood-brain barrier. It crosses the placenta. So the delivery mechanism is completely different than if you were just infected with SARS-CoV-2. And I will add an additional complication to all of this, as if that wasn't complicated enough. The additional complication that we have is the DNA contamination of the vaccines, the Pfizer vaccines, the Moderna vaccines, which we know from the work that has been done by Kevin McKernan, by Dr. Philip Buchholz, by Dr. David Speaker in Canada, who've tested vials and have found DNA contamination, billions of copies of DNA plasmids and fragments of DNA in every single vial of Pfizer and Moderna that they've tested, including the new booster shots. And you've got the SV40 promoter sequence in these DNA plasmids. So that adds an additional layer of complexity when we're looking at what may be causing cancers, because now you're introducing foreign DNA into every vaccinated individual in various quantities. We don't know yet if there are integration events where this DNA is being integrated into the person's genome. Is it being integrated into areas of tumor suppressor gene, for example, where it can knock out a tumor suppressor gene, or other sensitive areas? I mean, this is a whole another area where I think we have to consider a possibility.
Dr. Makis,
of
if it
causing
was, Dr. Makis, if it was going into a person's genome, would that be something that would be epigenetic, passed down through generations? The changes?
Well, theoretically, if it gets into the spermatozoa and the oocytes, I mean, you could theoretically pass that down.
Okay.
Dr. Makis, what's so curious, and I just was recently reading about this. So, that we've all read now that the vials were contaminated to 20-30% with these DNA plasmids from the processing and the manufacturing of the vaccines, both in Pfizer and Moderna. And we know that these DNA plasmids can swap out material in our microbiome. And then we now created these new species of microbes with the subsequent health effects certainly unknown. And we know that microbial well-being is responsible for 80% of immune function. Now, I've also read that there are RNA plasmids that can affect the microbiome and cause viroids. And so it's not just the DNA plasmids that can wreak havoc, but these RNA plasmids. And they didn't know that before. So now we're in this unknown territory of what's happening in the microbiome, which is key because for our listeners, the microbiome, I said, immune health, first line for detoxification. They create the neurotransmitters that run our brains, and they make vitamins, not to mention the other millions of functions of things that the microbiome does. So I am personally concerned about microbial rebirth here, and we don't have any idea of what we're doing. Can you comment on that? I'm certainly curious and hear your ideas about that.
Well, again, so you've mentioned yet another complication. I'll give you yet another one on top of that, and that is I've spoken to Dr. David Speaker, the geneticist at the University of Guelph, who did the sequencing and confirmed, the DNA plasmid contamination, the DNA contamination. He told me that he suspects that there are also these DNA RNA hybrid structures.
Yes.
Where these molecules sort of bind and create this, these structures, these hybrid structures that you can't break down enzymatically. And so we have no idea what that does clinically, in an individual as well. And I think this is one of the reasons.
Could that be linked to the clotting? Would those structures, could that look like the white clotting that was happening?
I don't believe so. I believe the clotting, the clotting is probably an issue of proteins that are generated, abnormal proteins. Now we know we have production of mutated spike proteins. There's also production of really other proteins that we don't even know what they look like, what their 3D structure is, and what their function is.
I mean, I should step in here because I'm sure you're aware of this issue of the methyl pseudouridines causing a very much greater likelihood of it skipping a beat. And ending up getting off, frame shifting and getting off on the wrong frame, then everything's different. So you get a completely different protein that it makes up and produces according to the off center. But it's not lined up the right way. It doesn't produce a spike protein. It produces something totally different. And that's been shown experimentally as well, that methyl pseudouridine is causing that to be a much more common phenomenon than it would be normally.
And, and just a clinical sidebar, we're calling those things clots, and they're actually not true clots. And in mainstream medicine, they're treating these people with all sorts of anti-clotting medications, but then don't work because there's no blood, there's no heme component to break down using traditional anti-clotting medications. So those therapeutics are working on something that is not related. So when you have those, we've all seen those coroner's reports pulling out these thick, proteinaceous, amyloid-like materials that I think Dr. Montagnier classified like 3 years ago prior to his passing. So we even have a treatment mismatch, which goes to what I've heard you say in another interview. I don't want to hijack the conversation here, but that we have cancers that are not responding to standard treatments because it's not standard mechanisms. So here yet is another point where these clots, which are not clots, structures, no standard medical treatment, like these aggressive tumors I've heard you speak about in other podcasts, are not responding to classic chemotherapeutics. So maybe you want to respond to that.
Well, just generally speaking, if you don't understand the underlying pathophysiology and the underlying mechanism, you really have no hope of treating something that you don't understand. And I think this is where we're at with these extremely aggressive turbo cancers, is oncologists don't understand what they're dealing with. And so they're hitting these cancers with their usual arsenal of, the standard chemotherapy regimens or radiation therapy, or even some of the immunotherapy regimens that have worked in the past for cancers that developed under different conditions than these cancers are developing under, because we've never had a genetic therapy that has been introduced in millions of individuals. And so oncologists, because they don't understand what they're dealing with, the treatments don't work. And the work that Dr. Seneff is doing, and why it's so important, is trying to understand the underlying pathophysiology of how these cancers are arising, so that then we can try to figure out how to treat them. Going back to the clots, I'm trying to remember the original question for the clots.
Well, actually, before the clots, you were talking about the DNA and RNA hybrid
yes.
structures,
So
and I interrupted
think
you and talked
yeah,
about.
So I think that doesn't really have to do with the clots, other than the fact that you're producing all kinds of abnormal proteins, like I said, amyloidogenic proteins, even amyloid proteins that I guess have the ability to create microtubules, so maybe provide scaffolding for some of these clots. You have the production of prions. This has been a concern in some corners as well. So
platelet activation as well, platelet activation.
Yes, exactly. So that is another big issue that again, if you don't understand the underlying mechanism and you're trying to just treat it with blood thinners, you're going to have no success. Now, going back to the microbiome, we're just kind of making our way backwards. The microbiome, I believe, is extremely important in all of this. There's Dr. Hazan, I believe, has done tremendous amount of work in this area. I believe she was the first one who's come out and said that once people have had a vaccine, a Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, it completely destroys their microbiome. It wipes out their
bifidobacteria disappear.
And I think that is a fascinating finding that should get much more attention
I agree.
from the medical establishment than it has.
After the publication of that paper, which was brilliant, because babies need bifidobacteria. That is the key cornerstone microbe in babies. And 100 years ago, babies were just a monoculture of Bifidobacteria infantis. That was it. So, but when I went back after her paper came out, I went back and looked at every vaccine ever produced for children, and I didn't find one paper that looked at the effect of any vaccine, MMR, DTaP, polio, on the microbiome. I was like, well, there must be other papers. And there are none. And I stand corrected if someone in our audience or you, sir, or anybody can find a paper where they actually looked at this phenomenon. I believe Dr. Hazan was the first. And as you know, she did, I think, 30 years of clinical trials for the FDA. She was no stranger to academic medicine. And after she came out with her study, although her N was small but significant, she got literally gaslit, not unlike what happened to you, sir, from her social media, from her communities, from academia, etc. So hats off to Dr. Hazan for being a warrior, as to you, Dr. Makis. So this microbiome effect of toxicity is huge, and in children, because in the first 3 years of life, I keep bringing back to kids, sorry, in the first 3 years of your life, your immunologic profile is literally set. Your thymus, little gland behind your sternum, programs your T cell function even before birth. And then with mom's help through inheritance of mom's microbiome through the vaginal birth and breast milk, then that programming starts to develop the innate immunity, which you need to defend yourself against, cancers and other, viruses, other infections. So I know I'm kind of off on a tangent here, and I want to wrap back to what you were talking about, to microbial well-being. But we are interjecting these experimental therapeutics without understanding the full impact, and nor do we have any kind of scientific inquiry prior on previous vaccines, which don't really matter because this is not a vaccine, as we all know, it's a gene therapy. But what we do know is that genetic interventions do affect the microbiome, because what we know is GMOs and CRISPRs alter the microbiome. And we've known that for a long time. We've known it in cattle, chickens, and humans. So we understand that genetic modifications alter the microbiome. And what we have is an immunomodulatory therapy, gene modification. So it would make common sense based on other GMOs, it's a genetically modified product, correct? That it would have a similar effect. Maybe, I don't know your thoughts, you guys, on this, or maybe I'm on a microbiome ramble, I'm not really sure.
I would pick up on the thymus there, and I'd like to say something about the thymus because I've got a paper under review. I don't know if we're going to get it published.
Let's do that, Steph.
Because the thymus is very, very interesting to me, and I dug into the literature on the immune system, and I found some very fascinating stuff about the immune cells. So the vaccine goes into the muscle, the immune cells are attracted, they take up the vaccine. It's a lipid nanoparticle. So normally the spike, the virus would not infect the immune cells. They don't have the ACE2 receptor. But they're perfectly capable of taking up these lipid nanoparticles. So they get transfected with the mRNA. They start making spike protein, and they get activated. They get majorly activated. And a certain percentage of those activated immune cells make their way to the thymus. And they go to the thymus to sort of start to train for the emergence of new kinds of antibody, to get the production going for the kinds of immune cells you need that are trained on that particular information about that spike protein. But the problem is they keep making the spike protein. They expose the epithelial cells in the thymus to that spike protein. Those epithelial cells express high levels of ACE2. They pick it up, they get destroyed. And when you destroy the epithelial cells in the thymus, you cause accelerated thymic involution, which is basically increased aging of the immune system. So accelerated aging of the immune system. And then, of course, the immune system becomes weak. You end up with increased cancer risk, increased risk for autoimmune disease. All of these things happen as your immune system ages. So you're basically accelerating the rate at which the young person's immune system becomes old through that process.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about children and what you're seeing, because I never understood the idea of a vaccine rollout in kids, because kids have a robust immune system. They have high levels of natural killer cells. They also have decreased ACE2 receptors. So having taken care of a lot of kids with COVID, out of all the kids in a very busy pediatric practice, I think we had one sick one who had underlying other conditions, which made her prone, who developed complications, out of hundreds of sick kids with COVID, like nothing, like absolutely nothing. So we know that. So this thymus, maybe we can talk about children and the COVID vaccine, cancer risk in kids, this a phenomenon of, Stephanie, of thymic involution, because there are some things we can do to offset this, and we'll get to that. But maybe you can perhaps share some of your thoughts about children and cancer, because that is one of our biggest concerns as parents and practitioners.
I was against the rollout of the COVID vaccines in kids of any age. And I started speaking out about it on Twitter. And it's actually what killed my Twitter account and really almost killed my social media presence completely, because once I was banned from Twitter in March of 2022, which is when they were really coming after the kids,
Yep.
especially the kids 5 to 11 years old. Once I was banned from Twitter, I told my wife, that's it, I'm done. We're just going to, live our lives and protect our family, and that's it. And my wife said, no, you got to keep speaking out. So it's thanks to my wife that I've continued. And
she's the hero.
Exactly. And it took a year for me to actually get my account back. And then I started my Substack when I got my Twitter account back as well. But I was very much against this, especially because just of the unknowns of how a child's immune system would handle these genetic treatments. And I can tell you what I've seen clinically. And you would know this from some of the mainstream media outlets, but I saw it in Canada when they rolled out the vaccines in children 5 to 11 years old. At the first 2 doses, they were also simultaneously rolling out the booster shots in kids 12 to 19 years old. About 6 to 9 months down the road, we had the worst flu season in history in Canada. And this has occurred in the United Kingdom. This has occurred in Australia. This has occurred in the United States. Every highly vaccinated country that vaccinated kids is reporting the worst flu season ever. And it's usually, 6 to 9 months after vaccination when I've noticed that there seems to be a significant drop in immune function or some kind of a immune dysfunction that develops over that time frame. So this is what I've seen in kids and vaccinated kids. And what's interesting is that the kids who've been vaccinated with these COVID vaccines, they do much worse than unvaccinated kids. I see this with my kids who are unvaccinated and they do fine. If they get sick, and they have gotten the sniffles, I get them some elderberry syrup, maybe a little bit of ivermectin, lysine. I sneak a few things, quercetin. I sneak a few things, maybe into applesauce for them, and they bounce back after 2-3 days. They're back to school like nothing happened. But their vaccinated friends are sick for prolonged periods of times. Whenever they catch anything, they're sick for a week, for 2, and they have to take time off school.
Yeah, 2 weeks or more. My son was sick probably 4 times in a matter of 2 months, but it was only for 2 or 3 days at a time. But it was like every time he went back to school, do you know what I mean? I think it was when he went back to school and was around kids that were vaccinated or adults that were vaccinated, it seemed almost like this flu virus thing that was going around this past, or it was a COVID, this past couple months, this season was especially virulent. It was especially exhausting and hard to get rid of, and it just caused a lot of fatigue in people that I don't remember really being that present in previous years. Was that your experience?
Yes, and so probably high viral loads in kids who've been vaccinated and whose immune system has been impacted. Another thing I want to mention, and this is very crucial, is that now children are dying from what used to be mild infections. You'd have a mild case of influenza or strep throat, and healthy children who've been COVID vaccinated are dying. They're developing sepsis, and they're dying from these infections where in the past, they'd be able to handle these infections. I mean, worst case scenario, maybe they develop a pneumonia, they'd have to get some antibiotics. But healthy children are dying, and this is we haven't seen this before.
And are they dying from cancer, or are they dying from
No.
lung?
They're dying from the infections. They're dying from complications. They're dying from complications of influenza, complications of strep, meningitis. I mean, you name it. But they're dying from infection.
And Dr. Makis, a couple points about this I want to bring up quickly is one that in 2022 there was a 70% increase in Lyme disease, and what the CDC said, we're increased reporting. We weren't increased reporting. There was more Lyme disease because I think there are many people who, when they get COVID, their Lyme disease is activated. Many people walk around with chronic Lyme and co-infections, and that's a whole nother conversation. But it went up by 70%, which is enormous. And I think a lot of kids with long COVID, I keep saying kids, people actually have underlying Lyme and co-infections, whether it's Lyme, Bartonella, Epstein-Barr, herpes, rickettsial infections, etc. That's number one. Number two, what I'm seeing mostly, and I haven't been seeing, I get a lot of requests for help with kids who keep getting sick, and kids are getting a routine infection after infection after infection, and I know their immune systems have been devastated, as you've just said. But perhaps you can also talk about what Zen just brought up with even with her own son, is shedding. Now, Dr. Corey is right on a tirade about shedding, he's been posting a lot and writing about vaccine shedding. How at risk are the unvaccinated from being shed upon and inducing serious changes in immune function? Are they at risk for cancers, increased risk for cancers? Do we even have that information?
Well, that's a good question. Shedding is real. I'll start there. Shedding is very real. I mean, it's been admitted to by Pfizer in their own clinical trial documents. They don't call it shedding. And I always, anyone who comes at me and says, well, this is a conspiracy theory, shedding doesn't exist, it's a conspiracy theory. Well, no, Pfizer has admitted this in their documents. They call it environmental exposure. Through inhalation or skin contact. And they were worried about pregnant women being exposed to shedding. And that was supposed to be, report it to a safety officer if there was such an exposure. So shedding is very real. Now, the big question is, how does shedding affect an unvaccinated child or an unvaccinated individual? And I don't have the answer to that. I don't know if anybody does. It would be good if we could quantify the exposure. If we could actually quantify what people are being exposed to, so we know that you can shed the lipid nanoparticle with the mRNA, and at least in the first few days of someone who's been vaccinated, they'll be shedding the entire particle through bodily fluids. We know that you can shed extracellular vesicles or exosomes with either the mRNA. So, for example, in breast milk, you find these extracellular vesicles with mRNA in breast milk. But you could shed them. You could through exhalation or through bodily fluids, and then of course the spike protein, you can shed that in extracellular vesicles or exosomes as well for really a prolonged period of time. And no one knows exactly how long. I think the longest I've seen in the literature is 6 months for shedding of spike protein. Dr. Seneff, maybe you could correct me if...
No, that's my number too. I mean, certainly it's been around, it's shown to be in the body still after 6 months, which is really amazing to me. The mRNA and of course the spike protein as well. Yeah, it's
but it potentially could be shedding longer.
Yes. That's as long as we've looked, as far as I remember. Haven't looked beyond 6 months.
Exactly. So I've thought about this. When you have an unvaccinated child who's living with two vaccinated parents who've been taking the vaccines on a regular basis. Let's say the parents are taking vaccines every 6 months. So every 6 months, there's going to be, this increased shedding of the lipid nanoparticles, shedding of the mRNA. Then you've got this constant shedding of the spike protein. What is the effect on that child being exposed, on a daily basis, living with with multiple individuals who are shedding, maybe older siblings as well? So now you've potentially got 3 or 4 or 5 individuals in the household who are vaccinated and shedding, these various, whether it's spike protein or mRNA and so on. I believe that, there has to be some effect. Now, can this effect be permanent? I don't know. I really can't give you that answer. Certainly, I think, the risk and possibility is there. Even the risk of cancer, I've heard this now. If such a risk exists, it would have to still be an extremely small risk. But I cannot tell you that the risk is zero.
Yeah. Maybe this would be a good opportunity, because we're in Dr. Doom and Gloom school here, and people who are listening are probably going, "Oh my God, what have we done? Vaccine remorse. I'm married to a vaxxed person. Oh my God." I have no people who are looking for partners saying unvaxxed only. The Red Cross just came out and said, "Have you been vaccinated? Please let us know before you donate your blood." So there's all kinds of stuff out there. Let's talk about, maybe you can suggest, since we're so focused just really on cancers on this show, what can we tell people how to do? What can they do to offset, prevent cancers? Because one of the things that I read just today, getting ready for this show, is that oncologists as of 2021 and 2024, like the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, are still recommending COVID vaccines for their cancer patients. It's just shocking.
And before we get to that, Michelle, I'm so sorry to derail a little bit, but I just need to go to what he just talked about with the shedding. I need to know, is it the amount of the spike protein that's shed, or the what was the other thing that's shed? The mRNA? Is it the amount? Like, does the amount matter as far as these changes that start happening in the bodies? What I have down here, just to recap so far, is there could be DNA mutation. There's nanoparticles that can have an effect, I'm imagining, on the function of the organs in the bodies. There's foreign DNA. There's the suppressing of the immune system. There's clotting. There's prions. There's platelet activating that happens. I'm not quite sure what that means. And then there's the microbiome disruption. And then there's the thymus, which is going to accelerate aging in the immune system. So is it the amount of the spike protein and the mRNA that gets transferred possibly in shedding that would do that? Is any amount going to possibly spark some of these side effects, or does it have to be a large amount? Do we have any idea about that, like actually getting injected?
So again, I would have to just give you a hypothesis here. My hypothesis is that dose absolutely matters. It is, especially when you're being exposed to something that is so inflammatory like this. Dose does matter. How much you're exposed to. Also, it's not just the dose itself that you're exposed to, which you're hoping that you'd be exposed to very small doses in terms of the exosomes in the air or the bodily fluids, but there's also this exposure over time. So if you're being repeatedly exposed over every single day,
Like
over and
boosters, or kissing
no,
somebody?
no. So what I'm referring to is, I'll give you an example. Let's take a massage therapist
Mm.
who massages vaccinated people on a daily basis.
Yep.
For hours at a time. Every single day, they're getting exposure, right? I've had people come to me and say, look, I've done massage, I've felt really sick after, massaging vaccinated individuals. I've developed some health problems over time. So it could be not just the dose at one exposure, but this repeated exposure over and over again. And again, we just don't know the long-term effect of that kind of exposure either. The risk is not zero, I can tell you that. People have talked about miscarriages. Certainly, unvaccinated women have talked about bleeding, vaginal bleeding.
For 29 days straight after a massage. From a
Really?
person
Okay.
from a person who had just massaged people who were vaccinated.
And
then 20
I've
days,
heard-
17 days. Yeah.
airplanes are toxic. I've gotten spiked from being on airplanes, and they've looked at wastewater in airplanes, and it's like full of spike protein. And I was with a recently vaccinated person. Not recently. She got recently vaccinated. I got vertigo almost immediately after being with her. I'm unvaxxed, and it took me a couple of weeks to get rid of it. But ivermectin was sure on my protocol, and so it's real. And I have tons of anecdotal situations of people who've been spiked. Some a colleague with a GI bleed after every time he was around a spike person who got a recent vaccination, he got a GI bleed, and it was like clockwork.
Wow.
I mean, so it's real, and those exosomes that are transmitted or whatever the mechanism is. And also, babies and children shed through poop, and so if you're handling diapers or children's parts, that's another way you pick it up. And that was true even for other vaccines anyway, like MMR and others, and polio. You excrete these things in the stool for a long time.
Well, we do need to get to the.
I wanted to bring it, if you don't mind, I wanted to bring it back to the children and the risk of cancer from these COVID vaccines. I can tell you right now what I'm seeing in vaccinated children. Now, they did lower the dose. I believe Pfizer lowered the dose of the mRNA in their vaccine down to 1/3 for children under 11 years old, I believe. People can sort of double check that. So I haven't seen, the most cancers that I've seen, it kind of starts in the late teens, in sort of 18, 19, 20, 21. And really this is the group. Now, these are usually senior high school students, but these are college students, university students who were mandated to take COVID vaccines to stay in their program. They are getting hammered with turbo cancers, just absolutely devastated. And they're getting devastated with all kinds of extremely aggressive. We've talked about leukemias and lymphomas, for example, which are the big ones in this age group, but sarcomas, and the sarcomas are extremely vicious. These are cancers of the soft tissues, connective tissues. We see bone cancers, we see soft tissue cancers. There was recently a PhD student that got a angiosarcoma, cancer on the heart. I'm seeing a ton of angiosarcomas, which used to be extremely rare. You would see like one in your career, and now I've put out a Substack with 24 of them. So the young people, especially late teens, early 20s, are getting just absolutely hammered with these turbo cancers at rates we've never seen before. And it's also the presentations, the stage 4 presentations of breast cancer in people in their 20s, women in their 20s. We've never seen that before, not on a large scale. And certainly, you would expect some kind of a genetic anomaly in that case, and it's not genetic. It's they've taken the vaccines, and they're literally presenting with stage 4 breast cancers, usually triple negative breast cancers, which is again the most aggressive type, glioblastomas, brain cancers, and again the most aggressive types that you can have. What else? And of course, the vaccine mandated professions. You see healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, police officers, firefighters, military, teachers, anywhere where you had vaccine mandates, young people are getting absolutely destroyed with these turbo cancers. The turbo cancers happen across all ages. This is not just confined to the young, but we're seeing cancers in the young that we've never seen in young people, before at these rates.
Dr. Makis, let me ask a quick question. Why is it shot 3? It appears that you can slide with the first 2, and then that first booster really seems to be a tipping point for many. Any clinical feel about that?
So Dr. Seneff actually touched on this with the IgG4 antibody shift, which is a type of antibody that is a antibody involved in tolerance, in tolerating antigens. But what it does is it actually hides the tumor cells from the immune system, so the immune system tolerates tumor cells as well. And interestingly enough, you don't see a spike in IgG4 production after the first shot. You see a tiny bit of it after the second shot, and you see something like 500-fold increase from the second shot to the third shot. And of course, then you keep taking booster shots, you'll get more and more of this IgG4. And you get an explosion of this IgG4, which can actually give you tolerance to tumor cells that the immune system then no longer sees these cancer cells, and the cytotoxic T cells then are no longer destroying these cancer cells. So that could be one of the explanations, and I do believe it is a feature. I've published one paper on this. I was a co-author. It could be one of these potential mechanisms in play in people who've had, a booster shot, like their third shot or more. But I can tell you, I've seen extremely aggressive cancers after only 1 or 2 doses as well. So there are probably multiple mechanisms in play, and certainly we see the immune suppression. With the interferon, for example, we see that right away. We see that. You could see that with 1 shot only, and you can see that kind of changes in the cytokines, chemokines, composition of the immune system, and then the effect that has on immune signaling and cancer surveillance.
Well, Dr. Makis, we only have a few minutes left, but I think we do need to go over a little bit because we need to talk about what can people do that are concerned about, these aggressive, horrifying cancers.
So let me cure cancer in 2 minutes, right?
There you go. We're all very hopeful.
But I can tell you, these turbo cancers, and I get hundreds of messages in my inbox every day, people asking, and they're extremely difficult to deal with. They're very difficult to deal with, and usually the oncologists struggle with these turbo cancers, and often once they've exhausted, their first lines of treatment, the oncologists have nothing to offer. I would say if you're trying to, if we're talking about protecting children, for example, and so far I've only seen leukemias in the younger children who've been vaccinated. I haven't seen the other types of cancers yet, maybe an occasional lymphoma. As they start to get a little bit older in their teens, you start seeing the sarcomas, for example. But children, I would say diet, clean up the diet, get rid of sugar, get rid of seed oils. Cancer thrives on sugar. So you're going to try to get as much of that out of their diet as possible.
Eat organic, right?
Organic, yes. Vitamin D is another big one. Lots of sunshine. You could check vitamin D levels as well. This is for adults as well. Get vitamin D levels up because that is protective against certain types of cancers. The higher your vitamin D levels are. And then, obviously, exercise. You have to be careful, though, if you've been COVID vaccinated. You have to be careful with vigorous exercise because you have to be mindful of the high incidence of myocarditis, as high as 1 in 30 per shot. You may want to have a cardiac workup of some kind before you engage in really, extreme sort of physical activity. And then you can look at, you can look at all kinds of, supplements and nutraceuticals. You could look at, vitamin C, obviously. I've mentioned vitamin D, vitamin C. I look at things like quercetin, olive leaf, ivermectin, Artemisia annua, black seed, Nigella sativa. There are things that you can supplement that have protect, have anti-cancer properties that could offer you some protection over time, just on a prophylactic basis. And so, if people are really worried about cancer, they can take some of these supplements.
And so one of the things I'll throw out there, I had a recent patient consultation, a 4-month-old with idiopathic 4-month neutropenia. Mom received some COVID vaccine during pregnancy. I don't know which trimester she got it, and idiopathic neutropenia, and unusual in a 4-month-old. The baby does not have cancer, but concerning that a 4-month-old is neutropenic. And what I did, and I know you're not a homeopath, I know homeopathy was practiced widely in Canada until the communist country of Canada, followed by the communist country of California, took over. But so there is something called homeopathic thymulene, made from homeopathic thymus. And so I've given it to that baby as a way to stimulate the thymus in innate immunity. What we know protects you against cancers and infection is your innate immune system, 2 arms of the immune system, innate and adaptive. So the innate immune system, and particularly these natural killer cells, don't need to be trained by the organism. They just go out and kill based on receptors. So which is kind of cool. So the thymus will release these cells. They're in circulation. They go all over the body. And in kids, they like to go here in your lymph tissue. They like to go to your spleen. They like to go to your bone marrow. They're all over the place. But when they see cancer cells or viruses, they can attack via these receptor binding sites. So that's kind of cool. So everything we can do to boost innate immunity in kids. Curcumin, I keep saying kids, I mean grown-ups too, not just kids. Curcumin is a great immunomodulator, and make sure you take your curcumin with black pepper and fat. I like coconut because it's a medium chain triglyceride, and it's really great for your brain function, whether it's autism or Alzheimer's, at both ends of the spectrum. So those are immunomodulatory things, and anything that sort of breaks up inflammatory responses. So that could be curcumin, that could be enzymes like nattokinase, bromelase, serrapeptase, lumbrokinase. Great company, Canada, that makes lumbrokinase, actually. It's called Canada RNA, a company I've been using for a long time. Got to be careful with those enzymes because nattokinase comes from soy, and you don't want to use GMO soy because the soy from the US and Canada are GMO unless they're organic. And now I like to say organic regenerative in my new terminology. So using this enzymatic therapy to clean up the terrain. And I'm glad you mentioned sugar. We talk about sugar endlessly. We had a whole episode on sugar. But what cancer cells also don't like is alkalinization. They like a more acidic environment. So when you alkalinize, how do we do that? Drinking lemon water, right there, and veggies. Veggies are alkalinizing. So veggie forwards diets. And so we're talking about the same stuff all the time. And you haven't seen probably our podcast unless you're a devotee of our shows. We talk about this a lot. But you want to make the terrain less hospitable. And last but not least, I'll throw out one thing I'd love for you to consider, something that worked for a Lyme patient of mine many years ago. And I've only asked the parents to do it once. I didn't recommend it. These are not recommendations. These are not medical recommendations for people. These are clinical suggestions for optimization of health. Is I had a very sick Lyme kid. He was dying, and he had been everywhere, and he was just dying. And we did a fecal transplant. Well, the mom did it. I didn't recommend it. The mom did it from a healthy donor. And if we took healthy poop from non-vaccinated kids who were younger than 3 years old, with a very heterogeneous, robust microbiome with bifido and various lactobacillus strains, and we did a fecal transplant, I'm wondering if you can remodulate those infected, dysbiotic microbiota of cancer patients. And that would be my recommendation for you to Dr. Makis. If you want to look into that, I would be so thrilled, because I see you have a microscope behind you, to take a peek at that poop.
Well, Dr. Hazan has done that extensively, and so there'd be a lot of research on that. We would definitely need to have her on the show. Absolutely. We have a question that asks, would fasting have an effect on turbo cancer? Would that reduce the inflammation and the environment which helps the cancer grow?
It's interesting. I've been looking into fasting recently. Dr. Paul Merrick has, I believe, published recently on fasting. I think fasting is fascinating. Certainly, I would suggest it for people suffering from vaccine injuries, people suffering from long COVID, and people suffering from cancer. I would consider fasting. Now, again, it depends on your health state. If you're in a serious medical situation, you may want to have that monitored by a medical professional. But it's a specific kind of fasting, and it's the 3-day fasting, the 3-day water fast that stimulates autophagy, stimulates production of stem cells. You need that 3 days. People do this intermittent fasting, 12 hours, 16 hours, 24 hours. You will not get the benefits of the autophagy and the production of stem cells unless you do minimum 2 days, and typically 3 days, maybe 4 days if you're feeling adventurous. I've done a couple of 3-day fasts. It's very interesting. It's very rejuvenating. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's definitely doable, and you don't need to have any money. You don't need to buy any supplements for that. So it's something I highly recommend for everybody.
And we need to remind the audience that this is not medical advice. This is actually just an educational conversation. Please seek the attention of your medical doctor. We hope it is a functional medicine doctor or a holistic type doctor before you try any types of treatments or change up your supplements or anything like that. And I think we do need to bring this to a close. Dr. Pero, do we have anything else that we want to ask or wrap up?
I would have to say incredible gratitude to your work, Dr. Makis, for being a pioneer even before COVID, on your work, your outspokenness, your courage, integrity, and of course, to my esteemed colleagues, I don't know what I would do without Dr. Seneff and Zen Honeycutt, because they're my tribe and my team. For those of us who may have taken a few slings and arrows during the past few years, we're over that. We're way past that. That's old news. But we are so grateful for you coming on today, and we will continue to share your work and stay in community and stay in network and making us all healthier and stronger.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me on. People can find me on Twitter at MakisMD. And also on my Substack, makismd.substack.com.
Which is awesome.
Really great. I love your Substack.
And you're seeing this live on Rumble, and we hope that you will come back on the 3rd Tuesday of every month on the new MDs with Dr. Michelle Pero, Stephanie Seneff, PhD, myself, Zen Honeycutt, and the next guest. We don't know who it'll be, but we always love to get your feedback on what type of topics you would like us to cover. We are extremely honored to have you, Dr. William Makis. Thank you for spending your time with us. Everybody, please join his Substack and see what is going on. This has been an incredibly important topic, and we hope that you will share this episodes with your friends, your loved ones, and your doctors, because I guarantee you most of your doctors will not know the information that Stephanie Seneff and Dr. Makis and Dr. Michelle Pero discussed today. So thank you for helping us to work together, moms, doctors, scientists, dads, everybody, teachers, parents, working together to heal our children and our families. Thank you.
Thank you.